I babysat my brother on New Year's Eve, but he came home at 4 a.m. drunk and disrespected my time. Am I wrong for being angry? I am a childless woman of 25 years of age. For weeks, my friends and I had been anticipating a New Year's Eve celebration at a rooftop bar with delicious cuisine, live music, and a VYEW of the fireworks. The tickets were pre-VY-usly paid for by me. My brother, James, called 3 days before the new year. He needed a babysitter because he and his wife had been in VY-TED to a posh party. He asserted that they had exhausted all other options, including friends, neighbors, and babysitters. He guaranteed me they would return by 1 a.m. and promised to pay me twice. Unwilling to disappoint him, I reluctantly consented in the hopes of catching the last of my party at 6 p.m. On New Year's Eve, I reached their home. My brother described the children's nighttime routine while they were still in their pajamas. I got the kids to bed around 8:30 p.m. and they departed at 7 p.m. I was thinking about how much fun my friends were having as I browsed through my phone at 10 p.m. while lounging on the couch. I told myself that I could join them in just a few hours. I texted my brother around midnight to see whether they were on the road. No answer. I was irritated by 12:30 and attempted to contact him and his wife, but both calls went straight to voicemail. I even tried calling the location, but got no response. I was alarmed when I saw a picture of them looking fantastic at the party on social media. I became angry instead of worried. They were ignoring me, even though it was obvious they had their phones. I was angry at 2 a.m. I considered phoning their buddies, but decided against it to avoid making a disturbance. I also left voicemails and texts. The kids slept peacefully, oblivious to my annoyance. When they finally arrived at 4 a.m., my brother was intoxicated and his wife was not doing much better. I got up and went up to them without saying hello. What the DVYL? You promised to return at 1 o'clock. How many times have I phoned you, do you know? My brother chuckled and said, calm down. The new year is here. You didn't have anything significant anyhow. I was shocked by his contemptuous demeanor. Did their plans take precedence over mine? Did my time not count? I informed him that I was sick of being treated disrespectfully, and that if they were unable to honor my time or fulfill their commitments, I would no longer be able to watch the children. I was being dramatic, he replied, rolling his eyes. They only needed a night and couldn't find anyone. His wife muttered the following morning. I received a text from my brother warning me that I was being careless. He stated I should be more understanding and that they deserve to enjoy themselves. He even called me selfish, which was absurd considering the circumstances. They misled me and act as though my time is useless. In return for my numerous attempts to assist them, he is now upset with me since I told him I would no longer babysit. He says I'm overreacting and that I'm punishing him and his wife for a single error, but to me this is a pattern of conduct rather than just something that happens on New Year's Eve. The unwavering belief that I'll do anything to assist them and the total disregard for my personal boundaries. Because I adore my niece and nephew and don't want them to think I'm Leah VYing them, I'm torn. However, I also believe that I must advocate for myself. When will I establish boundaries if not now? Is it my fault that I've decided to stop babysitting? First update. I began to feel as though things were calming down a few weeks after the New Year's Eve disaster. To be honest, it felt like a weight had been taken off my shoulders when I committed to my choice to stop babysitting for my brother, even though I adore my niece and nephew. I couldn't keep putting myself in situations where I was taken advantage of and treated disrespectfully. It was about respecting myself, setting limits, and appreciating my own time. My phone rang one evening. My brother was the one. I paused before answering, speculating about the topic of the call. He requested me to watch the kids. After a clumsy beginning, he claimed that he and his spouse had no one else to turn to and were forced to work late. He expressed regret for the events of New Year's Eve, stating that they had learned their lesson and that it was an isolated incident. He underlined how much they trusted me with the kids and assured them it wouldn't happen again. He even said that I was the only one who could manage them. Despite my want to believe him, I was unable to do so. They had not only arrived home late on New Year's Eve, but they had also completely disregarded my sentiments, my plans, and my time. I informed him that I couldn't. I clarified that, particularly after being humiliated the last time, I wasn't prepared to be in that situation once again. He did not protest, which surprised me. He didn't exert pressure. He simply hung up. For a brief period, I felt relieved since I had defended myself and believed that was the end of it. However, my phone called once more later that evening. It was my mom, Clara, this time. I realized right away that she wasn't phoning to catch up. When she called from overseas where she had been residing for a few months, she immediately jumped in and expressed her disappointment at my refusal to assist my brother. She made statements that really resonated with me, such as, "You know how hard it is for them to juggle work and kids. If I were there, I'd be happy to take the kids off their hands." She seemed to be attempting to guilt me into agreeing, and my feelings of conflict increased as she spoke. On the one hand, I was aware that I had every right to refuse. I didn't have to intervene each time my brother and his spouse required assistance. On the other side, the idea that my niece and nephew were entangled in it was devastating. I eventually gave in to my mother's persistent demands, which included statements like, "It's just for one night, and you're their family. You have to be there for them, just for this one time." I promised her I would. With a tone of relief, almost triumph, she thanked me, and I hung up the phone with a mix of resignation and sadness. After work the following day, I arrived at my brother's place. My brother and his wife were on the verge of leaving, and the kids were already home bouncing around the leaving room. They hurried left the door after saying only a brief thank you, as if they were simply pleased that I had finally decided to help and didn't want to give me an opportunity to back out. I couldn't help but note how rushed they were with the kids. I became accustomed to the evening routine, food, playtime, and bedtime. Everything seemed recognizable, almost reassuring in its consistency. As usual, the children were sweet and oblivious to the conflict between their parents and myself. I briefly questioned whether I had overreacted. Perhaps they truly had nowhere else to turn, and I was providing assistance during a time of true need. However, the resentment persisted throughout the night. I enjoyed spending time with the kids, but that wasn't the main focus. It was about how, after everything that had transpired, my brother and his wife had placed me in this predicament once more. I couldn't stop thinking about how my brother laughed when I told him how angry I was on New Year's Eve and how he discounted my sentiments. This was not a single error. Rather, it was a pattern of total disregard for me as a human being with a life and obligations of my own. My brother texted me at around 9 p.m. to let me know they would be arriving home a little later than expected. I didn't respond. I remained silent. I simply hung up the phone and concentrated on getting the kids to sleep. Around 9:30, they eventually slept off, and I was left waiting for the door to open while sitting on the couch and watching the clock. They arrived home at midnight, which is somewhat later than I had committed to, but not as late as New Year's Eve. My brother said another halting thank you as they walked in, and I walked out without a word. I didn't think I could talk at that point without it becoming a heated debate. I was still apprehensive about the night before. When I got up the following morning, all of the resentment I had been attempting to control was rekindled when my brother and his wife arrived home late once more. In addition to feeling used, I also felt torn. Perhaps they arrived at work quite late. Perhaps they weren't taking advantage of me again. A part of me wanted to doubt them, but I kept thinking about it. I made some coffee and browsed through my phone before checking social media, which is a popular way to divert my attention from unresolved grievances. I found a tale that one of my brother's friends had posted as I was scrolling. It was an image of a welcoming cafe where people congregate to unwind and enjoy themselves. I didn't give it much thought at first, but then I saw that my brother and his wife were in the picture's backdrop. They appeared completely comfortable as they sat at a table chatting and sipping drinks. I briefly believed it to be an old photograph shot weeks or months ago. Then I noticed the timestamp. Though, when I was at their house the previous evening watching their children and wondering why they were getting home so late, I came across the post. They weren't at their jobs. They didn't experience an unforeseen crisis. I once again sacrificed my evening by sitting at their house while they were out having fun because I trusted their justifications. Anger and incredulity were brewing inside of me as I gazed at my phone. What were they able to do? They deceived me once more after all that transpired on New Year's Eve, despite all of the assurances and regrets. Even worse, they tricked me into believing that they needed my assistance because of an emergency, and I was duped once more. For some minutes, I was at a loss for what to do. A part of me wanted to dismiss it, act as though I hadn't noticed anything, and move on. However, my anger increased as I gave it more thought. This was a purposeful act of dishonesty, not only a small white lie. They purposefully chose to employ me since they knew I wouldn't consent to babysit in any other way, as if to make fun of me for thinking they would change. They took advantage of me once more. I was unable to stop. I texted my brother after opening my messaging app to let him know that I had seen the photos and that I was aware of his deceit. Despite my diminutive stature, I didn't hold back. I wanted him to understand that I wasn't gullible and that I wasn't going to ignore it. I waited for an answer while staring at my phone, feeling both anxious and excited. It was like adding salt to an open sore when he eventually responded. He acknowledged it. He claimed they lied since they were aware that I wouldn't have consented to babysit in any other situation. The EVY denke that my own brother and his wife had no trouble lying to me in order to obtain what they desired was there in black and white. He made no attempt to explain it or claim that it was a misunderstanding, simply said it was a premeditated move. Stunned, I sat there. There was nothing to say, and I wasn't even sure how to respond. I was stunned by the blatant insolence. It wasn't due to a breakdown in communication or a conflict in priorities. It was deceit and a total lack of concern for me personally. They viewed me as a convenience, someone they could utilize whenever it was convenient for them, rather than as a member of their family. In an attempt to comprehend what had just transpired, I set my phone aside and gazed out the window. Of course, I was angry, but I felt anguish more than anger. That I could be treated this way by my own brother was painful. It was painful that after repeatedly giving them the benefit of the doubt, I was shown to be mistaken. They took advantage of my trust and betrayed it. The remainder of the day was a blur. I was unable to concentrate on anything else. I repeatedly relived the incident in my mind, recalling all the instances in which I had sacrificed everything for them, putting their demands ahead of my own, only to be met with deceit and manipulation. The pattern was more important than the cafe shot alone, utter disregard for me as an indie dual with a life and priorities of my own. I made a choice at the end of the day. I had had enough of babysitting and going above and above for indie duals who obviously didn't appreciate me. There was no use in me confronting my brother anymore. He had stated unequivocally that he saw nothing wrong with his but this time I was determined to set a real barrier, put an end to babysitting. No more hurried phone calls. No more feeling guilty about giving up my time and effort for folks who couldn't even be honest with me. I experienced an odd sensation of relief as I sat there thinking about everything. Yes, it hurt, but it was liberating as well. I was at last prioritizing myself, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt that I was acting in the best interests of myself, not my mother or brother. Second update. After a few days, I was trying my best to move on from my brother's treachery. Even though I was still hurting, I had no intention of talking to him anymore, no matter how much guilt, manipulation, or slick talk I received. I had already decided that I would never again babysit. It wasn't worthwhile. I had tried to be the helpful, trustworthy sister for far too long, only to be taken advantage of and lied to. I assumed that if the matter didn't resolve itself, it was their fault, not mine. My phone then rang. It was my mother. At first, I didn't give it much thought, thinking it would be a friendly conversation or perhaps another attempt by her to coerce me into assisting my brother, but I knew something wasn't right as soon as I responded. She seemed annoyed, almost accusing, and I instantly prepared myself for whatever was about to happen. She got right into it, claiming that after talking to my brother, he informed her that I hadn't watched the kids that evening. I initially believed I had misheard her. She couldn't be saying what I believed her to be saying, surely. She continued, however, reciting what he had told her, namely that they had hired a nanny since I had declined to assist. My brother reportedly informed her that they intended to keep employing the nanny since, in his VYEW, I wasn't good with kids. I was taken entirely by surprise and startled. I had no idea how to interpret what I was hearing. In addition to VYing me and tricking me into watching the kids that evening, my brother was now lying to our mother about what had transpired. To make things worse, he was making fun of me by suggesting that I couldn't possibly take care of my niece and nephew. He seemed to be trying to twist the story to make himself appear like the VY Tim and was stepping up his disdain, which felt like a slap in the face. Naturally, my mother seemed to believe him. She began to ask, why didn't you just lend a hand? She had obviously accepted his account of events without questioning anything, saying things like, it's not that hard to watch kids for one evening. To be honest, that was nearly as painful as the falsehoods themselves. I had spent years demonstrating my dependability, my concern for my family, and my willingness to lend a hand whenever necessary. However, she was prepared to disregard all of it because my brother had made up a preposterous tale to hide his identity. I sat there trying to figure out why he would tell such a falsehood. Was it shame, guilt, or just another instance of his avoiding responsibility for his actions. Perhaps he didn't want to tell our mother that he and his spouse had lied to me about vying to work late, or that they had gone out to a cafe while I was at home with the kids. Perhaps it was simpler for him to blame me, to make it appear that I was the one who had failed them, than to acknowledge that he had been dishonest. I couldn't believe he would go to such length, though. Whatever of his motivations, it was now more about the idea behind it than it was about myself. He was trying to harm my reputation in our family by lying to our mother. For what purpose? To keep one's face intact, to escape accountability for his deeds. I didn't see how he could defend it to himself, and it felt harsh and petty. I came to the conclusion that there was no use in attempting to tell my mother the truth while she continued to speak. Her decision was already made. He had likely been extremely convincing in his account of events, and I knew my brother. I didn't have the energy to dispute, because it would just become a he said, she said situation. In addition, I had the feeling that it wasn't worth anything at all. Perhaps it said more about my mother than it did about me if she was so willing to believe him without hearing my side of the story. I hardly responded, letting her speak. I hung up and sat there looking at my phone when the discussion finally finished. I was exhausted, dejected, and most of all extremely wounded. It was more than simply the lies. It was about my own brother using me as a scapegoat to hide his inappropriate behavior, and my mother mindlessly supporting it. I repeatedly reenacted the scenario in my mind over the course of the following few days. I reflected on the numerous occasions I had gone above and beyond to support my brother, the sacrifices I had made for him and his family, and the apparent lack of appreciation on his part. I reflected on how my mother had assumed the worst about me without even attempting to get my side of the story, and how she had been so quick to support him, and the more I gave it more thought, the more I saw that this went beyond what had just transpired. My brother was always the golden child who could do no wrong, and I was supposed to take the fall for it. It was about a pattern, a dynamic that had existed for years. I briefly contemplated going up to my brother, confronting him, exposing his deception, and requesting an explanation. However, that idea appeared less tempting the more I considered it. What would it achieve? He had previously demonstrated his unwillingness to accept accountability for his deeds. To confront him with it would just result in more manipulation, more falsehoods, and more excuses. To be honest, I didn't require such negative tie in my life. I made the decision to stand back instead. I began concentrating on myself, stopped talking to my mother about the problem, and stopped returning my brother's calls. It wasn't simple. A part of me was concerned about how my connection with my niece and nephew could be impacted by the friction in my family, which I detested. However, I also realized that I couldn't continue to put myself in precarious circumstances where I was treated disrespectfully and taken advantage of. Ultimately, I understood that establishing boundaries was about protecting myself, not about punishing others. It was about not allowing the behavior of others to determine my value as a person, and although it was painful to take a step back, it was also freeing to prioritize myself at last. Third update. I avoided my mother and brother in the weeks and months that followed. Although it was a difficult choice, it was essential. I came to the realization that I needed time to recover and take care of myself after everything that had transpired. I made the decision to leave it all because the ongoing drama, deception, and disrespect had worn me down. Restoring my feeling of self-worth and establishing a life where I felt appreciated and respected were more important than merely establishing boundaries. I devoted all of my time to my career and interests throughout this period. I spent more time with friends who never made me feel like I was asking too much simply for being there, and who always gave me unwavering support. In addition to trying new things I had been putting off for years, like joining a local book club and taking up yoga, I began to accept social invitations more frequently. I was able to find who I was outside of the family dynamics that had taken up so much of my energy. Thanks to these seminars, I first met my boyfriend, David, on one of these outings with pals. I never would have imagined how he would alter my life. We first met at a small get-together at the home of a mutual acquaintance. I wasn't really excited to go at first since I was still dealing with the emotional fallout from everything that had happened to my family. However, my pals were correct when they said it would benefit me. I met him through a friend of a friend during a card game. We wound up sitting next to each other, and what began as lighthearted teasing over who would win evolved into a meaningful, interesting discussion. He was kind, focused, and sincerely interested in what I was saying. I felt heard and seen for the first time in a long time. We discussed everything from job to favorite movies to hobbies. And at the end of the night, I couldn't recall ever laughing so hard. We began seeing each other on a regular basis after that evening. Initially, it was informal coffee dates, park walks, and late-night phone conversations that continued into the morning. However, as the weeks passed, it became evident that this was something unique. In ways I didn't realize I needed, he was patient, kind, and encouraging. He reminded me that it's acceptable to put my own needs first, respected my limits, and pushed me to advocate for myself. It was refreshing to spend time with him. He didn't have the manipulation or emotional baggage I was so accustomed to from my family. Rather, he helped me realize that not all relationships need to be stressful or conflictual by bringing stability and optimism into my life. Additionally, he assisted me in managing my feelings toward my family by advising me to handle the matter diplomatically, while also reminding me that it was acceptable to leave if it was negatively impacting my mental well-being.